In 1912, the RMS Titanic represented the culmination of decades of years of experience at sea, a technological triumph of her age that harnessed all the newest innovations. And yet, a chance encounter with ancient ice sent her below in less than 3 hours. Now, reports at the time suggested the ship had gently and gradually slipped quietly from view. But 3/4 of a century later, the discovery of the wreck revealed the horrifying truth. Titanic's demise had been anything but gentle. It was terrifying, sudden, and violent. On this channel, we've analysed the ship's loss in all of its tragic violence, from the collapse of the funnels to the breakup of the hull and the destruction wrought on the stern as it slipped beneath the waves to the ocean floor. Studying and analysing the state of the wreck and what happened to the ship can greatly enhance the way that we understand the history, and it will help us really appreciate what the people aboard the ship went through in their final moments. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are the videos that we've made that catalogue and chronicle Titanic's terrifying, violent end. It's around 2:15 in the morning, April 15th, 1912, and the RMS Titanic does not have long to live. For the past 2 hours, the ship has fought a losing battle against buoyancy and gravity, and now she is beginning to give up her last ounce of strength in the fight to stay afloat. Compartments are flooded, hallways and ornate public rooms are slowly going under. It's now just a matter of time, and the clock has already started. The ship doesn't have much time left. What's about to play out is some of the most awful, harrowing drama to ever happen at sea. This 45,000-ton ocean liner is about to be violently swallowed by the ocean, and the hundreds of people clinging desperately to her for survival are about to endure a series of horrible events. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and today I've partnered with our good friends at Titanic Honor and Glory to use their incredible animations to bring to you some of the true horrifying stories from Titanic's final 5 minutes. In the immediate aftermath of Titanic's collision with the iceberg, it became clear that something was horribly wrong, but the realization wasn't quick. For the ship's crew and designers, it took some time to gauge what was actually happening, and slowly the clues began to come in. At the forepeak, the very front of the ship, a hissing noise was heard that indicated that air was being pushed out of a vent from somewhere deep within the ship, and only water could be the thing pushing the air out. Elsewhere, covers over cargo hatches began to bulge outwards because of that same effect. And after some 45 minutes, the situation had become clear. Titanic was sinking. She was going down slowly, but she would definitely sink. For 2 hours or so, the ship had settled slowly in the water, but it was so gradual that it tricked people into a false sense of security. Everybody thought the ship couldn't sink. That myth had spread through word of mouth and was even being pushed by the ship's officers and builders on board. But it was only after some of the early lifeboats were lowered and sent away with reluctant, maybe even cynical occupants that they noticed the ship was sitting lower by the head in the water, and it only got worse. For the next hour or so, the ship's boats were filled and lowered, and things had started off calmly. But by the end, when the feeling of the ship sinking underfoot could no longer be ignored, human drama began to play out, and panic settled in. By 2:10 in the morning, the ship's bow was underwater, and the last of her boats were being got ready, and the end seemed near. But then, things took an unexpected turn for the worst. Titanic took a plunge downward. We'll pick the story up at 2:10 a.m. Titanic's bridge front is dangerously close to the lapping waves. In the Marconi wireless room on the boat deck, Harold Bride and Jack Phillips, the two young wireless operators, are desperately firing off distress calls in an attempt to organise a rescue. They know that Carpathia, the nearest ship, is still hours away, and although they can't see outside from their office, they can tell the end must be near, because they can hear people rushing about outside on deck, and, perhaps more ominously, the ship's power is beginning to dwindle, and with it, so too is their wireless system's range. While Phillips taps out his urgent calls for help, Bride fiddles with the machinery to try to get the maximum power possible. Outside, on deck, things are getting desperate. The Titanic had a pronounced shear where either end of the ship was designed to rise slightly upward to aid against pitching up and down in the ocean. But this shear had masked the forward angle downward that Titanic had assumed all night. By now, that angle had reached about 8 or 9 degrees, and it was greater than the shear, and passengers could at last tell that their ship was going down by the head. The ones that began to crowd the deck outside could see something else that was ominous. The lifeboats were all gone. In the minutes prior, groups of panicked people had tried to force their way aboard the last to be lowered, but pistols had been fired by the crew to scare them away, and now, with the big wooden lifeboats all gone and rowing away from the ship, the crew were battling to release and fill the last remaining collapsible boats. These were an absolute last resort, a kind of flat-bottomed barge with canvas sides which could be raised to keep the water out. They were smaller than the main lifeboats, with an occupancy count of just 47, with around 1,500 people still left on board. There were now just spots left for 94 of them. But there was a problem. The boats are kept high up on the roof of the officers' quarters above the boat deck, where the davits, which are the lifeboat cranes, were located to actually launch the boats over the ship's side. First Officer William Murdoch has been in charge of lowering and filling lifeboats on Titanic's starboard or right-hand side, while Second Officer Charles Lightoller has commanded the port side operations. Now, both lead teams of men to manhandle those collapsible boats from off of the roof down onto the boat deck, where they can be filled and lowered away. There was a whole system for this. The collapsibles were meant to be attached with guy wires to the first funnel's support cables or stays, and the tackle could be used to then gradually lower the heavy boats down with simple pulleys. But there was a simple unforeseen problem with this neat arrangement. The tackle was stored forward in the bow section, which by now was already over 100 feet below the ocean's surface. The men struggled with the boats and maneuvered them by hand while crowds of people jostled and watched on helplessly. At the stern, dozens of people have gathered, instinctually attempting to get as far away from the water as possible, but it's a hopeless affair because sooner or later, the stern will be consumed as well. They are gathered in groups, with one passenger describing them as looking like clumps of bees. Many of them are third-class passengers. They had gathered earlier in the aft well deck near the general and smoking rooms to await instruction that simply never came. Now, with no boats left and the ship's bow slipping below, they gather at the stern and wait for the end. In the third-class general room, a woman nervously plays piano for her young daughter on her lap, and above her head, on the poop deck, two priests, Father Thomas Biles and Father Joseph Perushitz, are giving absolution, hearing confession and reciting the rosary to over 100 passengers who crowd around them. The stern is beginning to lift higher out of the air, and the 3 bronze screw propellers have emerged ominously from the ocean. Fighting his way through the crowd is 23-year-old storekeeper Frank Prentice. He has stood on the poop deck chatting idly with his friends Cyril Ricks and Michael Kieran, but now it's becoming too crowded. The trio begin to consider climbing over the port side railing and jumping. Down in the bowels of the ship, icy water roars through openings, not from below, but from above. Titanic has sunk slowly so far, with water coming in only through the iceberg-damaged hull, but now, with her bow underwater, tons and tons of ocean water can surge through the vents, cargo hatches, and open spaces up on deck. It means that the more Titanic goes under, the faster she sinks, and those not already up on deck are caught by the rapidly rising water level and drowned. At the base of the forward funnel, the crew, under Officers Murdoch and Lightoller, are still struggling with the collapsible boats when a huge crowd of third-class passengers surge out of a door from the first-class grand staircase at its entrance. It's not known where these dozens of people had come from or where they got held up down below, but for the crew planning to lower the last lifeboats, it was a sudden shock. They thought most of the women and children had got away safely, but now dozens more had appeared from nowhere, panicked and desperately seeking escape. In the wireless office, Titanic's radio men are still hard at work when a stoker creeps in to try to steal Philip's lifebelt from him while he works at the wireless key. Harold Bride strikes him down and knocks him out cold, so Phillips, who so far had been completely absorbed in his work, is at last persuaded to escape from the office. Bride later recalls of Phillips that he was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt a great reverence to see him standing there sticking to his work while everybody was raging about. The two men burst through the door on the port side of the boat deck and take it all in. Bride remembered that there were people running all over the place and that from somewhere aft, the ship's orchestra was still playing jaunty ragtime music. Bride hears a call for help from above his head. It's Second Officer Lightoller, who needs more men to bodily move Collapsible B down from the roof. He turns to help, but Phillips has left his side and run aft towards Titanic's stern. Bride will never see his friend again. Just behind Bride, around the second funnel, Titanic's band is preparing to play their last song. Band leader Wallace Hartley, 33, had once told a friend of his, who was another ship's musician, that he would play a hymn were he ever to be on a sinking ship. Having played cheery music all night, now the band begins to play a final, slow song as the chaos unfolds around them. The actual song chosen has been debated about for years. Harold Bride, about 100 feet away and busy helping free the collapsible boats, swears later in life that he heard the Song d'Automne, while others heard the hymn Nearer My God to Thee. But either way, the touching music is another ominous sign of impending doom because now water has begun to roar up the A-deck promenade stairs leading up to the boat deck. First Officer William Murdoch and his men on the starboard side have cranked in the number 1 davit and prepared it to attach the falls to Collapsible A, but now the time has come to get the boats down. Oars are rigged as spars to try to slide the boats down from the rooftop. On the starboard side, Collapsible A thumps down with a boom and lands right side up on the deck, but on the other side, Collapsible B collapses the spars under its massive weight and thunders onto the deck upside down. But now there's another problem. Titanic has taken on an enormous list to port, so now the area of the bridge and the boat deck around Collapsible B is already beginning to dip underwater. White foam begins to swirl around the recently freed boat, and there's no time to flip it over and attach it for lowering because the ocean has already risen to meet it. The crowd of refugees from below turns to flee in terror and panic, heading for the fake safety of the stern, which is lifting higher into the air with every second. Collapsible B simply floats off the deck upside down as the ship begins to disappear beneath it. And trapped underneath the boat somehow is wireless operator Harold Bride. He'd helped get the thing off the roof, and now he's caught underneath it, inside an air pocket. On the starboard side, the men under Officer Murdoch are working desperately to sort out their own collapsible boat. Nobody's exactly sure of the plan. Murdoch had ordered the davits cranked in, and now men are working at untangling the falls and tackle and trying to connect them to the boat. Sixth Officer James Moody has other ideas. He calls out, "We don't want the block, we'll leave the boat on the deck." His idea is to simply let it float off, but others are still trying to connect the falls. They try pushing and pulling the boat up the deck towards the davits, but it's no use. The boat just weighs too much. Then, with a roar, the ocean bursts up and out of the stairs leading up to the boat deck, and the ocean has at last reached them. Some jump into the boat, but then somebody shouted out that the plug hadn't yet been put in. At sea, the plug was left out so that any rainwater could simply drain out, but now, without it, the lifeboat will be swamped. Fireman John Thompson, with injuries from a steam scalding earlier in the night, struggles desperately to get the plug back in. He feels the boat begin to be lifted by the surging, foaming water from underneath him. The dozens of passengers who'd come up from below have panicked and tried to flee aft, but they've encountered an unexpected barrier. Titanic's boat deck was a huge, open space, but it was segregated. The forward half was for the use of first-class passengers, while the after half was shared by second-class passengers and the ship's engineers. All these sections were separated by low railings with gates, and now the crowd of terrified passengers, some 100 or 200 in total, run up against the railings and get stuck. A crush develops, and there is no getting through. The time is now 2:15 AM, and across the ship mouths call out for help that couldn't come. The Carpathia is still miles away, making full steam, but with no hope of arriving in time. Titanic's stern is now high out in the air. She's down by the head by about 10 or 11 degrees, but she seems to hang there. It's all happening in slow motion. Around the collapsible A boat, people cling on for dear life as white water sweeps around their feet. The crowds along the promenade deck struggle desperately to try to get through towards the stern. Meanwhile, at the very stern of the ship, people hold railings and each other for support. The two priests are still saying their absolutions. Then, abruptly, the end comes for Titanic. From somewhere deep below, the final pockets of air which have given the ship her buoyancy finally give out. Her bow section drops like a stone. What has so far been a slowly rising tide of water becomes a tidal wave. It speeds up the boat deck, washing collapsible boat A up and off the deck for good, with whoever could cling onto it in tow. The wave smashes into the people who have got caught in the railings on the promenade deck, and it knocks anybody who was unprepared for it off their feet. One man who was prepared was Second Officer Charles Lightoller. After getting collapsible B off the roof, he'd been helping with the other boat when the ship simply sank out from underneath him. He thought briefly about turning to run for the stern, but realised that this was futile. Instead, he dives from the bridge front into the ocean and strikes out for the crow's nest, which by now is level with the waterline. But he realises that this too is futile because soon it will be underwater. He turns to swim back when he's suddenly pulled underwater and has the great misfortune of becoming pinned to the giant open mouth of one of the massive stokehold intake vents. These things lead all the way down to the boiler rooms, which are themselves a giant open space, and now tons and tons of seawater are pouring in and keeping Lightoller stuck up against the grating. He begins to say his prayers, knowing that he's finished, but then a burst of hot air from below spits him off the grating and sends him to the surface. Gasping, he emerges and begins to swim away from the suction. At the very stern, Frank Prentice and his mates have climbed over the portside railing as the crowds on deck jostle. The ship's angle is increasing all the time. Titanic is now about 13 or 14 degrees down by the head. It means that the poop deck, which once stood 4 or 5 stories out of the water, is now up at least 10 stories high. As Titanic rears higher and higher out of the water, everything movable inside her begins to crash down. Furniture, plates, decor. It creates a symphony of destruction as everything shatters and breaks. The promenade deck's ornate windows have met the water now. They too begin to shatter inwards because of the pressure difference. Frank Prentice and his friends realise that the time has come. If they hold off from jumping any longer, then the fall will kill them. Frank is holding onto one of the notice boards, which once warned other smaller vessels to stay away from the Titanic's propellers. He lets go and falls straight past those same propellers which now sit high in the air. He is extremely lucky, as even though he's wearing a life jacket, he hits the water and survives. Many who tried this were killed instantly when their life jackets smashed back into their heads on impact, breaking their necks. Frank's friend Cyril Ricks hit debris on the way down and was killed. Prentice now finds himself surrounded by bodies and debris, with the massive ship's stern looming dangerously over him. He begins to swim away. On the boat deck, people are struggling to still rush afterwards for safety, while around the base of the forward funnel they swarm, caught off guard by the sudden plunge. They're swimming for nowhere in particular. Charles Lightoller was among them. He had survived being pinned to the vent intake and then emerged at the surface. Now he swims back for collapsible B and holds on. But then there is a loud crack like a gunshot, and then another one. The steel cable stays that connected Titanic's forward funnel to the boat deck are beginning to part ways. The funnel begins to lumber through the air like a drunk. It's coming down. It had actually been quite well supported against the forward angle because, by nature, it was angled itself backwards by about 3 or 4 degrees to help clear soot up and over the decks. But now, tons of water are pressing at its base. It's made of only thin steel plating, and it was never designed to survive this kind of pressure. The thing is 4 or 5 stories tall, and by itself weighs tons. It comes down with a roar onto the heads of dozens of people who are swimming in the water. One of them is Charles Dwayne Williams. His son Richard is just feet away when the funnel comes crashing down and crushes him. Richard was transfixed by the sight, recalling later that it wasn't because of the fact it had killed his father and missed him by mere feet, but because he was wondering at the enormous size of the funnel which still belched smoke. The forward funnel smashed into the ocean and created a huge wave which washed over Collapsible B and sent it away from the ship. Collapsible A was caught up in the wave too. It was sent spinning away like a toy, smashing into one of the lifeboat davits, causing one fireman to break his arm. The funnel broke loose and rolled off into the water, sinking, creating a new horror. Where it had once stood was now an open moor 25 feet across, a blank shaft that led deep into the bowels of the ship. Water now roared in and carried anybody close enough nearby with it into a swirling, hellish whirlpool. Then it's funnel number 2's turn. With a whoosh and a brilliant explosion of sparks from below, it smashes down into the water. The time is 2:17 a.m. and Titanic is dying. To the growing din of smashing glassware and windows comes a new noise, a dull roar. To some, it sounds like a passing locomotive in a subway. Some even mistake it to be the ship's machinery and boilers becoming unseated and crashing forward through the bulkheads, but that's not it. The noise begins to reach a crescendo. It's actually the Titanic's steel structure beginning to fail. Individual beams and columns are bent and begin to crack. Hull plating is tearing, rivets are popping, wood paneling is shattering. Under the strain, steam lines and pipes crack and burst. The lights, which have stayed on so far all night, are powered by steam dynamos. Without their supply of steam, they begin to wind down, and the lights snap off. Then, it happens. Titanic's weakened structure fails. The entire hull comes apart down to the waterline. With a sound like rolling thunder, her back is broken. The stern comes down into the water again, although more gently than you might expect. Some don't even ever see the ship break in two, although many do. Their testimony at future inquiries will eventually be ignored. The pride of British shipbuilding could not simply break in two, but it just did. Only hours earlier, the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, had told passengers that Titanic could be broken into sections and then those individual sections could remain afloat. But now his theory is about to be put to the test in the most horrifying way possible. His ship is rent apart. Funnel number 3 is caught off balance and tumbles off the ship, but funnel number 4 gets caught on the boat deck and stays in place after it collapses. Titanic's stern comes down almost level with the water again, and many think that it's returned to normal trim and will stay afloat. It stays there for a few long seconds, but then begins to rear up again. The break isn't a clean one. Sections of the lower hull remain intact. Plating, steel stringers and frames, the keel and the double bottom. Titanic's skeleton is strong, and it hasn't yet completely failed, but where the stern isn't flooded yet and full of air, the bow is now hundreds of thousands of tons of waterlogged dead weight. It is dropping for the sea floor like a stone and pulling the stern down with it. Holding on for dear life as the gargantuan stern section begins to whirl through the air is Chief Baker Charles Jochen. He clings to the starboard railing as the stern section is pulled down further and further and the angle increases in severity. Those in the lifeboats and the drifting collapsibles watch in shock as the stern rises up, twisting in a kind of semicircle. The stern is still full of air. It should take a long time to sink, but now it's being pulled down into the ocean as if a giant hand was grabbing it from below. Maybe the bow section remained attached, or maybe it was the enormous weight of her engines and machinery which still remained bolted in place. But either way, the stern now succumbs to the sea and gradually, calmly, begins to slip under. For those in the lifeboats, it looked elegant. 21-year-old steward Cecil Fitzpatrick later recalls that it was as neat and as clean a dive as was ever made by a fish. But inside the ship, the final plunge is anything but gentle. Tons of seawater surge unimpeded throughout. Wooden bulkheads and cabin partitions are demolished by a tsunami of ocean water. Boiling white water consumes the ship's poop deck, and Baker Charles Jochen lets go as it swirls around his waist. He barely gets his hair wet as the ship disappears from under him. The fantail goes under, and then the jackstaff, which once proudly flew the ship's blue ensign flag. There is a slight gulp. The time is about 2:20 a.m, and Titanic is gone. Left behind are hundreds of people who struggle in the water and call for help. From below there comes the sound of loud booms as the stern section, which is still not completely full of air, begins to implode. Decades later, when the wreckage is found, that stern section will be almost unrecognisable because of its violent end. The conditions in the water in the immediate aftermath of Titanic's sinking are later described by Charles Lightoller as being an utter nightmare of both sight and sound. Whether it was escaping coal dust or soot from the boilers, a dark haze settles over the scene after Titanic sinks, and then wreckage begins to burst through the surface from below. From the water, only about 40 to 50 will be saved by various means, including Frank Prentice. He's pulled aboard Lifeboat 4 and survives the night. So too does Charles Jochen and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. He leads a group of desperate survivors who balance precariously atop collapsible B all night, working to shift their body weight against the waves to prevent their small boat from rolling over. Wireless operator Harold Bride eventually emerges from beneath the boat and clambers aboard. He's frozen nearly solid, but he's safe. All around, hundreds of desperate passengers call out for help, but help is too far away. Carpathia is still hours from Titanic's last known position. The screams will go unheeded into the night. The final moments of the Titanic have been the source of debates, imagination, and horror for decades since the ship sank. In fact, for over a century now, we've all wondered, at one point or another, what happened out there that dark night. We all know the stories of brave men and women who gave up space in the boats for others, or about crew members and staff working to the last minutes to keep other people safe, or at the very least, comforted. But probably the defining moment of the sinking, the thing that grips the imagination and signalled the violent end of the beautiful ship's short life, was when Titanic was torn apart. The very fact the ship broke wasn't even officially accepted for decades after the sinking, with many survivors' testimonies discredited. It would have cast a shadow over the proud traditions of British shipbuilding. But dozens of other ships have sunk since Titanic, and very, very few have suffered the same kind of fate. Titanic was always going to sink to the bottom of the ocean, but that final, horrifying moment of violence was a surprise to many and continues to cause fiery debates to this day. Today, we'll look at 5 key areas of evidence to try and get an idea of what might have happened. First, we'll examine survivors' testimonies and the official record. Secondly, we'll review evidence from the wreck site itself. Thirdly, we'll look inside the ship at plans of the breakup zone and the mechanics of the ship's destruction. Then we'll look at some other examples of ships from history that broke apart. And finally, we'll assemble all of this together to paint a clearer picture of what might have happened. And today, we'll look at why and how the Titanic broke up. The story really needs no long introduction, especially for those of you who watch this channel regularly. Titanic was the latest thing in a long line of proud ships, each getting progressively larger. Lessons of safety at sea had been written in blood. Through the 17 and 1800s, horrific shipwrecks had given shipbuilders some ideas for how best to build a vessel. When Titanic set to sea, her builders and owners were vastly proud of their achievement. And honestly, who could blame them? Well, today, all that's left of Titanic is a tangled, decrepit wreck more than 3 kilometers, 12,500 feet, below the surface of the ocean. Critically, the ship is lying in two main sections. Both are separated by an enormous debris field, and it looks more like an air crash than a shipwreck. But how did the ship become like this? Titanic was the very latest thing in shipbuilding. She was made of heavy-duty steel and iron, with a hull construction designed specifically to prevent her from breaking under the immense strain of heaving seas. Now, the debris field and its contents tell us some fascinating stories, and gives tantalizing clues as to how the proud ship got into such a tragic state. But as ever, if you really want to understand something, you need to see the events through the eyes of the people that were there. We need to rewind the clock back over 110 years to the dark, cold night Titanic was lost. At about 20 past 2 in the morning of April 15th, 1912, Titanic was being pulled beneath the waves, lit only by the stars above. She had fought valiantly against flooding for 2 hours or so, but the end was inevitable. It left behind hundreds of people in the freezing water, and hundreds more better off in the lifeboats. But if not for the technological magic of the wireless Marconi machine, it's unlikely there would have been any survivors at all. As it was, the rescue vessel Carpathia was soon en route and picked up as many survivors as she could, some 706 people of the 2,200 who'd been on board. In the weeks and months to come, they'd be questioned by friends, family, and authorities about what it had been like, but their most important testimony would be heard by two courts of inquiry. Across two separate investigations, the first in the US and the second in Britain, crew and passengers alike were called before the committees to give some insight into what exactly had happened. Questions covered everything from the early parts of the voyage to the fateful encounter with the iceberg and beyond, but some of the most interesting testimony surrounds the ship's final moments. A little over 80 people were called upon to give testimony, and 17 spoke directly to the ship's final minutes. They were passengers and crew alike. Many of them had been in the boats, but some had also been struggling in the water nearby. Nearly all of them had a perfect, unobstructed view of events. Fortunately for the inquiry, 4 senior officers had survived and gave their testimonies. Now, through the course of the first inquiry in the US, somebody must have mentioned they thought they saw the ship break apart as she sank. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was the most senior surviving officer from the ship, and Senator Smith, who presided over the hearings, asked him about this. He said, "Was the vessel broken in two in any manner, or intact?" "Absolutely intact," Lightoller had answered. Later, the question was put to the third officer, Herbert Pittman, who claimed to have seen the ship too. Smith asked, "Did she seem to be broken in two?" And Pittman responded simply, "Oh no." The other surviving officers, Boxhall and Lowe, claimed they didn't get to see the ship sink at all. Lightoller's testimony was particularly convincing because he had been closest to the ship as she sank, washed away at the last possible minute. In the end, those 2 officers and 2 other passengers said they saw the ship sink in one piece. The matter was accepted as fact, and it remained the predominant theory for decades to come. Movies were made which showed the ship sink in one piece, paintings and all sorts, but then, in 1982, something interesting happened. At a historical society meeting that year, survivor Ruth Becker was telling her story to a packed room. Ruth was a young girl at the time of the sinking, just 12 years old, and she was travelling second class. Bundled into a lifeboat, she said she had watched Titanic sink quite clearly, and she told the conference something interesting. Parting her hands 2 ways, making motions representing the funnels falling, she told the audience she had seen the ship break apart. But as she finished, the microphone was taken by the host of the event, a historical society member, who reassured the audience that Ruth was wrong. That she'd actually just seen the funnels falling had been incorrect. After all, the official testimony of Titanic senior officers had been that the ship sank intact, and it would of course be easy for a young girl to misinterpret what she was seeing. So they thought. 3 years later, that young girl was proven right. Titanic was discovered 4 kilometers down and split into 2 sections. Reviewing the inquiry testimony and evidence is fascinating. I said that 2 of the ship's senior officers had said she sank intact and 2 passengers backed them up, but 13 other survivors had told the inquiries they saw it break in 2. One was able-bodied seaman John Poindexter, who said he was only 150 yards away from the sinking and that he thought he saw the ship break apart at, as he described, the foremost funnel. He was quizzed as to why he thought so, and he said, because she was short. The after part righted itself after the foremost part had disappeared. Thomas Ranger, a greaser who worked in the engineering department, made it even plainer. He said the forward end of the ship went underneath and seemed to break off, and the after part came back on a level keel. Reading this testimony, it all begins to line up. Frederick Scott, another greaser, said, "We'd just got at the stern of her when she started breaking up. She broke off at the after funnel, and when she broke off, her stern end came up in the air and came down on a level keel and disappeared." Sailor Frank Osman painted an even more dramatic picture. He said, "After she got to a certain angle, she exploded, broke in halves, and it seemed to me as if all the engines and everything that was in the after part slid out into the forward part, and then the after part came up right again, and as soon as it came up right, down it went again." 9 others said very much the same thing. And what's even more remarkable about this is that not many of them are passengers. Many are members of the ship's crew. Now that flies right in the face of the established narrative that Titanic had gone down in one piece. But why was the testimony ignored? Well, for one thing, many of the witnesses couldn't actually agree on where the break had happened. Poindexter had said that it was at the first funnel, while Scott said it was behind the fourth. This kind of discord did not go unnoticed by the Commissioner and the Attorney General at the British inquiry, who pointed out that the evidence was contrary. In fact, those overseeing the British inquiry don't seem very interested at all in entertaining the idea that Titanic broke up. The reason these eyewitnesses might have been overlooked and their testimony largely ignored, if not rejected, is lost to history. A cynic might say that the officers who said she sank intact were protecting company interests, and that the British inquiry was designed to salvage what little of the British shipbuilding world's reputation they could. The ship sinking was one thing, but breaking apart as it did so was something else entirely. There's another simple answer, that the idea the ship might break apart was simply inconceivable. They were still grappling with the idea that she could sink at all. In fact, many thought the iceberg had ripped a gash hundreds of feet long, and that had sent the ship to the bottom. By contrast, Edward Wilding, one of her designers, had estimated the hole left by the iceberg to be only 12 square feet large. Like the idea of a breakup, the pride of British shipbuilding being taken down by something so trivial as a 12 square foot hole might have been too much to handle. The final report made by the British inquiry makes no mention of Wilding's estimate and said simply the damage extended over a length of about 300 feet. Technically correct, but curiously vague enough to obscure the actual truth. Sadly, the survivor testimonies are garbled and confusing enough to contradict each other and confuse any researcher. But hidden in there is some fascinating insight and a couple of really interesting little clues dotted throughout. Baker Charles Jochen gave some particularly tantalizing testimony. He was inside the ship during the sinking and heard some interesting noises. He said, "I went to the deck pantry, and while I was in there I thought I would take a drink of water. While I was getting the drink of water, I heard a kind of crash as if something had buckled, as if part of the ship had buckled, and then I heard a rush overhead. You could have heard it, but you did not really know what it was. It wasn't an explosion or anything like that. It was like as if the iron was parting." Shortly after that, he went outside and climbed up to the stern, famously riding the ship down, he said, like an elevator. What Jochen was hearing might have been the Titanic's structure in some serious distress, with beams and girders bending and buckling under immense pressures. Now we'll put a pin in this evidence and come back to it later on, because fortunately, today we can turn our attention to something which paints even more of an evocative picture: the wreck itself. The Titanic's wreck is famously in a fairly tragic state. The bow is famously intact, although its back has been broken and its sides are blown out. The stern section is a different story, shredded almost like it's been blown up with explosives. Unfortunately, because stringent copyright ownership surrounds footage of the wreck, I can't show you actual images, but I can show you my own representations of what lies down there. Titanic is lying in 2 sections that both point northeast, and both sections are about 600 meters or 2,000 feet apart. In between, and especially around the shattered stern section, is a monumental debris field containing countless pieces of the ship, everything from delicate, intact crockery, glasses and wine bottles, to enormous pieces of steel torn up like they were paper. When Robert Ballard and his team, working for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, found the site in the 80s, they mapped it out by hand, but over the years, closer inspection has revealed some hidden, fascinating truths. But one thing was obvious from the outset in 1985. A huge amount of Titanic was seemingly missing. Now this is a comparison that I drew of the ship's profile as it was in 1912 when she was new, and then the wreck after she sank. The bow section is probably the largest and comprises this much of the ship. The stern section, 600 metres away, is fairly large too, albeit in a pathetic state, and it comprises about this much of the ship, but missing in between is about 100 feet, or 30 metres, of the ship's middle. From about the third funnel and back, an entire section of Titanic is just gone. Or at least, it seems to be. To Ballard and his team, it must have seemed like Titanic had just disintegrated in the middle, and that 100 feet of ship had been crushed into oblivion. But closer examinations of the debris field in future dives showed otherwise. Slowly, through careful study of photos by experts, telltale signs began to reveal themselves. A massive chunk became known as the forward tower because it would have stood about 4 or 5 stories tall beneath the ship's third funnel. A second huge chunk of the ship's middle was found too, known as the aft tower. It encompasses about 3 stories of the ship's superstructure behind the third funnel. Within the debris field, other pieces could be made out, but they weren't intact like the 2 so-called towers. Big chunks of the deck house below the 4th funnel here, as well as sections from the lower hull near the engines. Finally, a chunk known as the galley deck section was found crumpled and buckled on the sea floor. This had once comprised a third-class kitchen area. Now, these individual pieces had once made up Titanic's centre, and somehow they had been torn apart. But what's interesting is the fact that these pieces, some as big as houses and buildings, stayed intact or broke off as whole units. Much of the ship is difficult, if not impossible to identify, but some pieces are a little easier than others. One of these is the so-called Big Piece. It's a 50-ton fragment of Titanic's starboard side, broken off and sitting almost perfectly within the breakup zone. It gives us some clue as to where the breakup might have originated from. More on this one later. One more tantalising piece of evidence was found. Famously discussed by James Cameron and his team of experts around about the 100th anniversary of the sinking in 1912, 2 matching pieces of the ship's double bottom, the keel and her very backbone, were found ripped apart, but when analysed and joined digitally, it was found that they'd once fit perfectly together. Crucially, they'd once sat below the third funnel, meaning that now all of Titanic's keel and bottom was accounted for on the wreck site. Interestingly, the ends of the keel are bent upward, as if they'd been smushed together at some point, and we'll get that specific point later on. Now, looking at these individual pieces of the ship alone, it can be hard to interpret exactly what's happened here. Clearly, something catastrophic had occurred, causing the centre of the ship to essentially fall apart. It tells us, obviously, that's where Titanic broke up, but to understand why, we need to take a look inside the ship and learn what might have led to the failure that broke her into pieces. This is a gorgeous set of plans for Titanic made by Matt DeWinkler from Titanic Honor and Glory. You can buy a set of these for yourself. I'll include a link down below. They're simply stunning, made after years of research and studying the ship with assistance provided by the Titanic Honor and Glory team and a litany of experts on the ship. It shows us how Titanic likely looked inside, deck by deck, with even the furniture's location marked out. Now this is extremely useful in understanding what exactly was destroyed during the breakup and how it might have happened. Starting here, on the boat deck, Titanic's uppermost deck, we can see that the forward and aft towers account for a good chunk of this part of the wreck, and that the break happened somewhere around here. In this area, there are a few internal spaces because this is mostly an exposed promenade, but here you can see there's a unique feature of the ship, the reciprocating engine casing. This empty shaft ran all the way down to Titanic's engine room and helped ventilate the massive space, allowing hot air to rise up and out of the vessel. The third funnel's deck house sits slightly forward of this, and it comprises the officer's mess and a selection of fan units. Now, moving one deck down to A deck, we can see more interior spaces of the ship. Now, crucially, you can see that around here, there's a lot of empty space. The third funnel's casing, which vented smoke out of boiler rooms 1 and 2, the reciprocating engine room casing right behind it, the well for the first-class aft grand staircase behind that, and then another empty shaft, the turbine engine casing. This shaft supplied ventilation to the turbine engine room, which was directly behind the main engines. Famously, Titanic's 4th funnel was kind of a dummy in that it didn't vent smoke from any of the boilers, but it did serve to allow hot air to rise and escape from the turbine room. In this section of the ship, we know that the first-class smoking room, the First class grand staircase entrance and a good chunk of the lounge were essentially ripped from the ship during the break. From B deck down to C deck, things become a little more monotonous. Cabins upon cabins, some might say, but here we see the first class restaurant and Café Parisien, all lost during the sinking. Now on C deck, around the breakup zone, we can see cabins and saloons for the maids and valets on board the ship. All of this disintegrated at some point during the sinking, but interestingly on C deck, we can see the first class barbershop here. It had once featured a striped barber pole outside fixed to the wood panelling. An early indicator that the ship had actually broken apart was the fact that the barber pole was spotted floating on the surface the next morning. From a lifeboat, survivor Arthur Pushin had spotted it, and he later said that, "To my surprise, I saw the barber's pole floating." The barber's pole was on the C deck, my recollection is, and that must have been a tremendous explosion to allow this pole to have broken free from its fastenings and drift with the wood. Pushin was convinced the ship had broken up because of this, as well as the terrible sounds that he'd heard. He was one of the 17 who testified to witnessing Titanic breaking apart. Although he didn't actually see it, he stated he just heard it. Now, something else important happened here. I mentioned earlier that the big piece, a chunk of Titanic's hull, had broken free from the side of the ship. Now this piece spans about 3 decks high, and it actually starts here. It aligns with the cabins C79 and C81 with the bathroom in between them. Clearly, this entire section of the ship was ripped apart during the sinking. On D deck below, things get a little more interesting around the breakup zone. This was the busy pantry and galley system that serviced the 2 main dining saloons for first and then second class. It featured dozens of pieces of cooking machinery and service utensils. One clue Ballard and his team had had early on that Titanic had broken up somewhere was that cooking utensils and things like pots and pans absolutely littered the sea floor, and further investigation revealed why. The entire complex was destroyed, and now the most intact part of it is a section of the first class pantry, wrapped up somewhere in the forward tower. The big piece is located here on D deck, with a portion of the pantry's wall in the region of this cold locker remaining. Below that, on a E deck, other interesting things begin to happen. The tops of the engine cylinders rise up this high, so now the reciprocating engine casing widens outboard. Now this is an immense space, the largest opening in any of the ship's decks. At some point during Titanic's sinking, the forwardmost engine cylinders, the low pressure ones, were ripped right off their cast iron bed plates and landed in the debris field. Down on F deck, the turbine casing now widens out too to provide space for the machinery in that room, creating a section of Titanic that is essentially full of holes. You have the individual uptakes for boiler rooms 2 and 1, followed by the reciprocating engine room and finally the turbine engine casing. Now that's a lot of vacant space within the ship, so of course the area was heavily reinforced with stiffeners and girders as well as additional beams and heavy-duty bulkheads. The third class galley here remains as one piece on the wreck, an individual chunk torn from the ship, but the rest has been smashed to pieces and lies twisted and bent somewhere out there in the debris field. Below, on the G deck and the Olop deck, we finally make it into the boiler room casings and the machinery spaces. Now the stern section still contains the turbine engine room intact, although it's now mostly buried by collapsing steel sections from above. The reciprocating engine room is exposed, but boiler room 1 is gone, ripped entirely from the ship. In fact, the first view Robert Ballard and his team had of Titanic back in 1985 was from a single-ended boiler sitting upright on the sea floor. That had once sat here in boiler room number 1. On the tank top, we can actually see the arrangement of the boilers themselves, the engines and the turbines. Now critically, this shows us where the 2 sections of the double bottom and tank top were torn from, the first here and the second behind it. The boilers of boiler room 2 remain in place, fully exposed by the jagged edges of a huge tear where the centre sections of the ship had once stood. So now we know where Titanic broke up, the spaces that were destroyed, and the pieces that have so far been found. Now if this isn't starting to paint a clearer picture for you yet, don't worry because it's fairly confusing stuff. But studying the individual pieces can reveal some interesting ideas. For example, we know the Titanic's keel, the ship's backbone and very bottom, is now in 4 pieces. The bow section, the first keel fragment, the second keel fragment, and then the stern section, and that the fragments have their ends bent and twisted upward. Now, this kind of bending would indicate an area of extreme stress on Titanic's structure, where the 7-foot tall keel and the incredibly stiff supporting steel skeleton around it was twisted like wet cardboard. But what could have done that? Well, to answer this, we now need to look at the mechanics of the sinking itself and the insane forces that were at play. We all know the familiar old sight of Titanic's stern lifted up high, high out of the water, lights blazing, as she's slowly swallowed by the ocean. This comes a lot from survivors' testimonies, people saying that row upon row of portholes shone brightly and the propellers were lifted clear out of the water. The thing is that estimating the exact degree of the sinking is difficult, and sometimes eyewitnesses can be unreliable. I mean, after all, nobody was sitting there watching with their protractors out, measuring. The sheer magnitude and shocking nature of such a sight could, inevitably, lead to some exaggeration, and totally fair enough too. For a long time, it was thought the Titanic had reached something like a 45-degree angle while she was sinking. But this seems extremely unlikely, and all for the simple reason that we know now the ship broke apart. To explain this, let's look at Titanic's basic structure and how the whole thing was built. We'll take a cross-section of the ship like it was a loaf of bread. At the very bottom, and really the first step in the process of actually building a ship like this, the keel bar was laid, and the keel was placed atop it, and then the floors, which spanned the width of the ship, were laid to create the ship's backbone. Now this was sealed with plating on top and beneath, creating what is known as the double bottom, a safety feature which not only strengthened the ship's backbone, but also provided protection from grounding damage from below, turning the ship's underside into a large watertight compartment about 6 or 7 feet tall. Now the double bottom also forms the bottom aspect of what is essentially a large box girder, and the basic strengthening mechanic of Titanic's hull. See, ships are expected to survive a great many conditions at sea, ranging from the fair and calm to the downright terrifying. Waves can soar stories tall, and riding over them can put unbelievable stresses on the ship. Hogging and sagging is what happens to a ship as it crests a wave. They're so big and long that they basically bend in the middle as they ride the wave top. It's a scary thought, but it's basic engineering. If you make the ship too stiff, it would simply snap. The secret to engineering a ship like Titanic was to make it strong, but flexible. So to do this, the hull got its strength from essentially following the design principles of a simple box girder. A box girder, like the name suggests, essentially uses 4 main sections. In this case, that was the Titanic's double bottom, both sides of the ship's hull, and then the strength deck on Titanic, that was B deck. Now this made up the entirety of the ship's hull, and then additional decks were simply attached on top. This was the superstructure. It served no structural purpose for Titanic, and didn't serve to support or reinforce the hull in any way. They were simply attached on top of the main load-bearing structure below. The sides of the ship drew their strength from the massive steel frames, the ship's ribs, which were spaced at intervals ranging from 24 and 27 inches, that's 68 centimeters at the extreme ends of the ship, to 36 inches or 91 centimeters in the middle. Spacing the frames out like this meant Titanic was allowed a certain degree of flexibility in the middle, so she could hog and sag the correct degree to survive riding over heavy seas. The benefits of box girders are that they're resistant to torsion or twisting, and when supplemented by additional columns, they have excellent load-bearing properties. This makes them a popular choice for bridge construction to this day, but scale a box girder up to the size of a ship like Titanic, and you're left with a strong, flexible structure that's perfectly suited to riding through the biggest seas. But a long structure, even as strong as a box girder, has its limits. Titanic was 882 feet, or 269 meters in length, an immense span which tested engineers of the day. The ship's hull was designed to survive normal, day-to-day seagoing conditions. It was not designed to exceed that. Breaking down the physics to their most simple elements, on the night of the sinking, as Titanic's stern began to rise up out into the air as her water-filled bow began to drop like a stone, the ship became a giant 882-foot-long lever. Now levers have been used for centuries as a basic, simple machine to shift heavy loads. Situated on a fulcrum, the lever can pivot, put a load at one end, and with a little effort at the other, you can lift the loaded end up. Simple stuff. But naturally through the whole process, the lever itself is under huge strain, not only from the load, but then also from the effort. At the centre of the strain is the fulcrum, the lever's pivot point. We can apply this basic mechanical principle to Titanic at about 2:15 in the morning. With the bow waterlogged and sunken, the load, The stern has begun to rise higher and higher out into the air. The stern is full of machinery and has its own inherent weight, about 15,000 tons. The effort, which thanks to gravity is always acting to push the stern back down towards the water, and this is the important part, because a lever, overloaded, will inevitably snap, and the snapping point will inevitably be where the forces and stresses are focused, usually towards the fulcrum. That night, as Titanic swung higher into the air, her midship section began to act as the fulcrum. Unfortunately, thanks to a series of interesting events, we know its position exactly. The fulcrum of Titanic's sinking motion centered around this hole in the ship's side. It's called the condenser discharge outlet. It's a port for seawater that had been drawn through the ship's condenser units to cool hot steam back into water to feed through the boilers again in a continual loop. It usually sat a few feet above the waterline, and through the night of the sinking, it stayed put. We know it didn't drop by any large amount because later on, as Lifeboat 13 was being lowered, they were almost flooded by it as it pumped water out as usual. Now the fact that it stayed in place a few feet above the waterline tells us that the fulcrum of the sinking was somewhere around here, and of course, it's right in the breakup zone. Now we're beginning to get an understanding of where the forces might be building as Titanic rises higher in the air. Soon she'll reach her designed limits. But for now, let's take a look at what these stresses actually are. Titanic's box girder-like hull is now under extreme pressures. Down below, at the bottom of the structure, the action of the lever, Titanic's hull itself is beginning to compress the lower sections of the hull together as she hogs in the middle. Remember, at sea, Titanic was expected to hog and sag. Hogging in waves would put the hull under the same kind of compressive forces lower down, but at no point would the full weight of a 15 or 20,000 ton stern section be expected to be independently supported by the rest of the hull. As the lower section compresses, the upper sections, the strength decks, and below, are being forced apart, because they are under tension. The deck's being pulled taut as the stern fights its fight against gravity, and remember the stern's weight, the effort of the lever, is constantly trying to force it down. Titanic hogs badly, and its hull is inevitably going to break. So we know Titanic must have broken at a fairly shallow angle. It's thought the stresses reach their maximum at about 20 or 25 degrees. With the hull under extreme pressure, the lower part under compression and the top part in tension, we all know the outcome. There was a break. And now we can begin to take all these pieces of information and evidence, the survivor testimonies, the wreck's remains, and all the mechanics at play, and begin to draw up conclusions over how and where the break occurred. But first, let's look at some final pieces of evidence, not actually directly related to Titanic, but from other ships, because as it happens, Titanic is not the first or last ship to ever violently break apart. But it turns out that lots of ships have encountered scenarios that far exceeded their design limits, and a lot of these resemble the damage that was actually inflicted upon Titanic. In 1948, the Royal Mail steamship Magdalena was on her maiden voyage from Britain to the east coast of South America when she ran aground. Now she was briefly refloated and towed when, as the bow took on flooding and was down by 45 feet or 14 meters, she snapped in half. Now it happened as the ship passed over a sandbank. This clearly acted as something of a fulcrum to Magdalena's lever, as it were. It was a clean, neat break, straight down from top to bottom, as if the ship had been sliced with a red-hot knife. Now the superstructure forward of the funnel, now lacking its support from below, began to cave inward and essentially fall out of the open tear. We'll come back to that later. In the 1990s, the former SS America famously ran aground too. Stuck on the sandy bottom of Fuerteventura Beach in the Canary Islands, the ship's hull was pounded by Atlantic waves. Remarkably, on the very first night, the tons and tons of high-quality steel that made up the ship's hull was overcome. She broke in two, again, a clean break as if the steel had just been ripped down the middle. Now this was different to Titanic. It wasn't a vertical break, but one from side to side. The stern section broke up, but the bow section remained behind for years after the stern had sunk, looking stunningly similar in concept to the bow section of Titanic. Finally, let's look at the infamous T2 tanker ships, products of the Second World War. Now these things deserve their own video, but in essence the US Navy was rudely shocked by the fact that these 10,000 ton vessels were breaking, seemingly at random, into halves. In 1952, the SS Pendleton, caught in a gale, broke in half riding a wave and sank. Now, this wasn't actually the first T2 tanker to suffer such a fate. In fact, it wasn't even the only T2 tanker to sink that same day. SS Fort Mercer cracked, then broke in two and sank as well. Well, actually, she only half sank. The stern section survived, stayed afloat, was salvaged and grafted to a new bow section to become a whole new ship. Nearly a decade earlier, the tanker Schenectady had been sitting at her moorings, brand new, having just completed her sea trials, when suddenly, completely unprompted, she split cleanly in half. Now hopefully this doesn't add to your list of fears that might stop you from going onto a cruise ship, but the sound from the break was like a cannon shot that can be heard from miles away. Now that we've looked at the physics at play behind a ship in heavy seas, the causes of Pendleton and Fort Mercer's losses in the gale is fairly easily explainable. The ship's hogging and sagging must have exceeded their hull's maximum design limits. Now, whether or not this was caused by metal fatigue or faulty welding is up for some debate, but at some point a weakness in those ships' hulls caused them to break in two. Now, the far more alarming case is that of Schenectady. She was just sitting in port when she suddenly broke in half. Now, the reason for this might shock you. It was the cold. Ships are designed to operate in cold weather, of course, otherwise icebreakers wouldn't exist. Now, at the time, the Coast Guard blamed faulty welding, but years later, a more likely culprit was brought forward: the water temperature. That January night, the water was 39 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius, while the air temperature was about 26 Fahrenheit or -3 degrees Celsius. Schenectady had been built using what today we'd consider a low grade of steel. In the cold, the steel simply became brittle. If there were any defective welds or seams in the hull, the stresses would concentrate, but the steel wouldn't be able to hold. Like falling dominoes, the crack, once started, would rip right around the hull and sever it in two. Now, crucially, this wasn't a particularly slow process. In one loud bang, the hull separated nearly totally, and the ship's back was nearly broken. The crack had run from the top strength deck all the way down to the keel, but the keel and the bottom plating held on and weren't severed. Now, this may seem shocking to you, and it should. The reason the Coast Guard blamed the faulty weld alone is because advanced metallurgy and the effects of temperature on steel weren't fully understood back then. 4 years later, Schenectady's sister ship, Ponegantset, suffered an identical fate. In cold water, she broke nearly in two, with the keel holding on for dear life, albeit jackknifed upward. Now, these are some pretty extraordinary cases, but they demonstrate how a ship behaves when the hull is put under extreme stress in a variety of conditions. None of these ships, though, underwent the sheer amount of stress Titanic's hull did that night. With at least a third of Titanic raised unsupported, out in the air at a shallow angle, it seems inevitable that she'd break. But hold on, I hear you ask. What about the ships that didn't break in half as they sank? The closest analogues to Titanic that we have are Lusitania and Britannic. Britannic was Titanic's sister ship, very similar at first glance in layout and construction. When Lusitania and Britannic sank, they both had their stern sections rise high out of the water too, and at the same kind of shallow angles that caused Titanic to break apart. Why didn't they break in half as well? Well, there are a couple of slight differences. Titanic, at the end, was sinking on a fairly even keel, while Britannic and Lusitania had been listing badly to the side, which might have concentrated the immense forces elsewhere in the hull, preventing a clean break, although definitely stressing them to their absolute maximums. For all their similarities though, Lusitania and Britannic were built fairly differently to Titanic. Lusitania was a completely different design, using longitudinal bulkheads in her boiler rooms that ran the length of the ship. These could have given some kind of reinforcement against hogging during the sinking, and Britannic had also been reinforced after Titanic's sinking with additional bulkheads too. But the crucial factor, in my opinion though, is the temperature. Remember Schenectady? She'd spontaneously broken nearly in two in water that was 39 Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. But Titanic was sinking in water that was even colder, about 28 Fahrenheit or -2 Celsius. Now, the quality of Titanic's steel has been brought up many times in discussion around the collision with the iceberg. It's been blamed for allowing the ship to sink at all. Now, in my opinion, that's totally unfair because, honestly, any riveted ship in that situation would have had its hull opened up too. Titanic was built with the highest grade of steel shipbuilders could use back in 1912, but 1912 quality steel is very different to 2023 quality steel. Back then, it was made in furnaces with open hearths, which naturally allowed for impurities to be introduced to the steel, typically sulfur and phosphorus. And naturally, this would reduce the steel's ability to withstand fracturing in cold water. To put it simply, sulfur in steel is bad news. It's an impurity that compromises the strength of the material. But manganese, on the other hand, is a transition metal that improves steel's resistance to wearing and fracturing. Steel, recovered from the wreck of Titanic, has been analysed and shows that there's a fairly low level of manganese in comparison to the sulfur present. Now, suffice it to say, Schenectady and her sisters probably had steel with similar or less amounts of manganese or higher levels of sulfur and impurities present in the steel as well. In 1942, when Schenectady broke apart, this wasn't properly understood. And 30 years earlier, in Titanic's day, the knowledge was even more basic. Engineers had a basic understanding that elements like sulfur and phosphorus increased the likelihood of cracking in steel, but it wasn't until World War II, when ships like Schenectady were breaking up, that proper chemical analysis was undertaken. A modern-day report completed by the US Department of Commerce makes for incredible reading. I'll actually include a link down below. After performing tests on Titanic's steel, the analysts came to these conclusions. The measured fracture toughness of the steel from the hull of Titanic is unacceptably low for use as a structural material at ice water temperatures. This is likely not due to any one single material characteristic, but a combination of several. The report goes on to list the levels of sulfur present, the ratio of manganese to carbon, and some other chemical reasons. Interestingly, they found that large manganese and sulfur particles may have actually acted as crack initiators within the steel in cold water, but it wasn't just the cold that did it. The report goes on to say this: because of a lack of understanding of notch sensitivity in iron-based alloys, there was no attempt to remove stress concentrations from the architecture of the ship. These are commonly found at hatch corners, strake junctions, and the like. These were found to be sources of brittle cracks in Liberty ships during and after World War II. The steel used to construct the RMS Titanic's hull, though adequate in strength, possessed a very low fracture toughness at ice water temperatures. It's possible that brittle steel contributed to the damage at the bow during the impact of the iceberg, but much more likely that the brittle steel was a factor in the breakup of the ship at the surface. Now this might seem damning. How could the ship's engineers get away with using such shoddy stuff? Well, it's been the source of conjecture for poorly researched articles for decades, but the simple truth is, for the time, this was the best we had. Without advanced chemical knowledge of metalworking, Titanic's engineers just couldn't have known. Chances are you've driven over a railway bridge or gone into a building being held up by this exact same type of steel. For its day, it was the pinnacle of technology. By the time Titanic came along, steel had only become popular for use in ships' hulls less than 30 years earlier. The US report ends with these notes. Steps could have been taken to heat treat the steel to improve its fracture properties, but this knowledge was simply not available in 1911. Given the knowledge base available to engineers at the time of the ship's construction, it is the author's opinion that no apparent metallurgical mistakes were made in the construction of RMS Titanic. We've now looked at Titanic's breakup from a variety of different angles, from the testimonies of those that were there to the remains of the wreck that sit on the seafloor today. We've looked at the mechanics and physics at play, the extreme stress Titanic's hull was put under, and we've even examined other ships that broke apart on the surface not too long after Titanic had. Now we've examined Titanic's steel under the microscope to get an idea of what it was made of and how it performed in cold water. So with all of that out of the way, now it's time to revisit the night Titanic actually sank and put all the evidence that we've accumulated so far back together and see how the ship might have broken up. It's shortly after 2 in the morning of April 15th, 1912. Titanic's bow has sunk far below the ocean's surface. Dozens of people cling onto the stern for refuge, but it's all too temporary. The end is coming. From a distance, passengers and crew in lifeboats look on as the stern rises higher and higher out of the water, reaching about 25 degrees or so. Inside the ship, down on E-deck, Baker Charles Jochen had been in his cabin. When he goes to a pantry, he begins to hear a strange noise. He later said, "I heard a kind of buckling crash as if something had buckled, as if part of the ship had buckled. It was not an explosion or anything like that, it was like as if the iron was parting." He makes a break for it and rushes up on deck. He doesn't know it yet, but what he's hearing is the steel members of Titanic's hull beginning to fail. His cabin is exactly in the area that is about to be rent apart. It would have taken some time for Jochen to rush up the flights of stairs and battle his way up to the very stern of the ship, where he joined the others holding on for dear life, so We can assume that Titanic's hull had been hogging and was beginning to fail for some minutes before it finally snapped. What exactly Jochen heard is up for debate. It could have been individual beams parting ways or rivets popping under the strain. We know now that Titanic's hull, a giant lever, was beginning to hog badly under the strain, and only minutes were left. The US Department of Commerce report tells us that there were no attempts to remove stress concentrations from the architecture of the ship. These are commonly found at hatch corners, strake junctions, and the like. And crucially, right at the fulcrum, where all the stresses are concentrated on Titanic, are a vast series of empty shafts, the engine room casings. The US Department of Commerce mentioned hatch corners. Like engine casings, hatches are empty shafts that lead deep into the belly of the ship. As the decks begin to flex and bend with the hogging of the hull, stresses begin to concentrate and build up in corners and on joining seams. In this area of the ship, there are a lot of them. Cracks probably begin to originate in the casings and radiate outwards. Because the steel on the outside is subjected to freezing cold water and air temperatures, the shell plating itself may have begun to fail as well. Titanic's lights go out as the ship's hull breaks, possibly because steam lines that serve the electric dynamos are severed as the ship tears apart. We know from parts of the wreck that several things have had to have happened. The double bottom and keel are jackknifed and bent upward. Now this exact thing happened to the Schenectady 30 years later. The double bottom and the keel, the lowest section of Titanic's hull, are under extreme compression. The hull fails here, and the two sections of double bottom begin to get smushed together, bending up and breaking the forward engine cylinder's bed plates in the process, loosening them. Meanwhile, the cracks radiating out of the casings above begin to focus on one section in particular, beneath the third funnel. It's under extreme tension, being rent apart. The seams and joints here provide neat, right angles for the fractures to follow. They join as one and snap. Like Schenectady and the other ships we looked at, Titanic's breakup is sudden, violent, and clean. With a roar, she suddenly parts cleanly just forward of the third funnel. Magdalena, America, and the other ships break neatly in two as well, as if they were made of glass, and Titanic is no different. As Titanic breaks, the double bottom is bent, but it's not totally broken. It clings on for dear life, just like Schenectady's had, and the bow section, no longer supported by the stern, begins to drop to the sea floor. The stern has fallen down level, which a lot of survivors actually see and report on. The double bottom is still attached. There's a moment of strange equilibrium, as the stern falls back to an even level, but then more destruction occurs. Frank Osman had watched it all happen. He later said that the ship broke in halves, and it seemed to me as if all the engines and everything that was in the after part slid out into the forward part. When the RMS Magdalena had broken half decades later, the superstructure, which was once supported by the deck houses and hull below, sagged down and began to collapse. Photos taken from the inside show the lounge roof collapsing and the entire structure was at risk of falling off the ship. Well, these remarkable photographs of Magdalena's breakup are probably the closest thing we'll ever see to what Titanic looked like immediately after she broke up. With nothing tangible now supporting these massive, heavy structures, they begin to fail. The forward tower, a huge chunk of the ship beneath the third funnel, breaks free from the stern and falls into the water, bringing pieces of the galley and the engine room casing with it. The bow now plunges down, and all the strain is placed on the keel and double bottom. Schenectady and Ponegantset's keels had held, but they were never put through this same kind of strain. The stern begins to tip up and plunge down, completely open to the ocean, and with no way to stop the flooding, the double bottom finally separates, and Titanic is in two major pieces. The exposed forward engine cylinders and their supports, each the height of a 3-story building, have already been severed by the jackknifing double bottom. They break free and tumble out as well. Connected to the stern is still a large section of the so-called aft tower, and whole pieces of the smoking room and deck houses that sat below the fourth funnel. But as the stern begins its wild dive for the sea floor, the exposed, jagged openings of the breakup zone are put through incredible hydrodynamic stresses. As before, cracks in the steel form up in seams and riveting joins, and the aft tower is ripped straight from the ship as one piece, followed by the deck houses below the fourth funnel. But that's not all. Almost all the shell plating is torn from Titanic's starboard side because now it's nowhere near as hydrodynamically shaped as the bow section, which planes away just fine and lands mostly intact on the sea floor. Way down on the sea floor, heavy iron objects with little hydrodynamic shaping land with a thunk like rocks sinking in a pond. The boilers and the engine cylinders are the heaviest and least elegantly shaped. They land with a huge thud in clumps almost exactly below where the ship had broken up on the surface. The tower sections are different. They're bigger, with more surface area, and like a sail in the wind, they suffer resistance moving through the water. They flutter out in different directions to land on the sea floor hundreds of feet away. The double bottom sections, the lightest of these individual break-up chunks, flap down like the wings of a gull, separate finally as the keel gives up, and land far apart and off to the side. With all resting on the sea floor, that's it. Titanic is gone. Now look, over the years, there have been dozens and dozens of theories as to how Titanic sank and broke up. And to be completely honest with you, and this will probably surprise a lot of you, I'm really not that interested in dabbling in the theories or what might have beens. In my opinion, it's pretty cut and dry. At the most, it's an interesting theoretical engineering exercise to try to figure out what exactly had happened. But in the end, it doesn't totally matter because Titanic was doomed anyway, and the end result was that hundreds of people died. Years since, enthusiasts have served to overcomplicate it, debate it endlessly. Hell, I'll be lucky if I don't get picked apart in the comments for this one. We only really need to look at other examples of ships from history that broke neatly in two. It might surprise you to know that something as big as an Oceanliner can just do that, but they can, and they have. Fortunately today, engineering and chemistry knowledge is so advanced that shipbuilders can actually predict how their ship will behave under most, if not all, conditions, and that actually includes in the possibility of it sinking. For example, the Queen Mary 2 has been designed, in the unlikely event of flooding, that if two of her compartments were to be breached and filled with water, she'd not be able to list over to either side to such an extent that the lifeboats couldn't be lowered. Today, steel is of an extremely high quality, something that engineers in 1912 just couldn't even have dreamt of. In the end, Titanic still stands as a symbol of engineering daring-do and know-how. She was built to the best standards available for the time, but that night she was simply stressed beyond her limits. And the result was a sudden, violent breakup. On the morning of April 15th, 1912, at around 2:15 AM, the end had come for RMS Titanic. As passengers and crew struggled around the base of the number 1 funnel to free and fill the lifeboats there, the ship took a dive down by the head and a wave washed up the boat deck. Suddenly, the desperate crowd was presented with a fresh misery. The forward funnel, the height of a 5-story building, came crashing down on their heads. Today, we're all familiar with the sight of Titanic's funnels. The 4 black and buff-coloured smokestacks have become something of an icon synonymous with the great ship itself. But what were they made of? How did they work, and why did they collapse as the ship sank? Other ships of the time sank, like Lusitania, and their funnels stayed in place until they hit the sea floor. What was it about Titanic's that made them come down? Today, we'll analyse the funnels, how they were made, how they worked, and the forces at play that caused them to fall. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. This is a guide to Titanic's funnels and why they collapsed. To understand why Titanic had 4 funnels at all, and why they were so big, we need to delve a little bit into the history behind these things. And don't worry, I promise you, it's an interesting story. In the early days of steam, ships carried 1 or 2 small boilers to generate the steam, so only a single chimney-styled smokestack was required. But then, as vessels grew in size and complexity, the number of horsepower required to move each ship increased, and so did the number of boilers. The earliest steamships had 1 or maybe 2 funnels, but in 1859, a new ship set to sea with no fewer than 5 of the things. There was a good reason for this. The SS Great Eastern was ridiculously big. In 1857, the biggest ship in the world was a steamer called Adriatic, which was about 354 feet, or 108 meters long, and 3,670 gross registered tons. And then a year later, Great Eastern was launched at 692 feet, that's 211 meters long, and 18,915 gross registered tons. Now that is a ridiculous jump in size. The ship was the brainchild of the revolutionary engineer Isambard Brunel, a legend and industrialist, and his ship, which he nicknamed his Great Babe, was an absolute outlier. Moving a ship that large through the water needed a similarly immense amount of horsepower. She was fitted with 4 steam engines for the paddles and another for her propeller, giving her an impressive speed of 14 knots. That's 26 kilometers per hour or 16 miles per hour. It was more than just impressive engineering for the time. It was achieved by supplying Great Eastern's engines with a monumental amount of coal and boilers to burn it and make the steam. The result was a then unheard of amount of 10 massive boilers producing both the required steam and a heap of thick, black, acrid coal smoke. Now, venting this up and out of the ship was the job of the funnels, and the larger number of boilers simply meant there needed to be more funnels to deal with the smoke. The 10 boilers were each paired to a funnel, resulting in the impressive array of 5 thin smokestacks, each one tall enough to ensure the worst of the smoke would pass harmlessly over passengers' heads on deck. Now, this ship is nothing short of an engineering marvel, but at the time, Great Eastern was actually mocked for its then ridiculous size and also for the number of funnels that it carried. It was just 50 or 60 years ahead of its time, and Brunel would have the last laugh because decades later, in the 1890s, German shipbuilders used essentially the same layout to create the blueprint for the world's first 4-funneled liner, the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. Now, obviously this was to do with the number of boilers and the speed that the ship needed to hit, but it caused a sensation with its 4 huge smokestacks, and carrying that many funnels became de rigueur for the most prestigious passenger ships on the Atlantic. Cunard Line were quick to follow up a few years later with their own pair of 4-funneled superliners, Lusitania and Mauretania, and then it was White Star Line's turn. Now, we understand why Titanic had 4 funnels. It was clearly to do with the arrangement and the layout of the boilers. The first 3 funnels were coupled to boilers and dealt with the smoke and fumes, but there's actually been a bit of a myth surrounding the 4th funnel, that it was just a dummy, only added for looks. If we cut Titanic down the middle, you can see that the 4th funnel really does sit over a part of the ship dense with machinery, the turbine engine room. Other ships of the day, like Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, provided deep shafts to ventilate the engine rooms and provide an exit for warm air. Titanic had one just like it over her main engine room too. But there was a peculiarity in Titanic's design that made her different to other ships. She had a 3rd engine, a steam turbine, that was different to her main engines. It needed its own ventilation as well. Now, White Star could have just installed another shaft or a dense pack of ventilators designed to draw in fresh air, but obviously that wouldn't work with the ship's balance, so the inclusion of a funnel as a ventilator here was, in that sense, for aesthetics. But the 4th funnel also vented smoke from 2 different key areas. The fireplace and the first-class smoking room here, but more crucially the massive galleys for the various dining saloons. That smoke from the ovens too needed to be lifted high over the heads of passengers, and the 4th funnel did the job. We'll have a closer look at how they did so shortly, but that was a brief explanation of how and why Titanic got her 4 funnels. Now, funnels also performed a secondary job of marketing their owners. A ship's funnels are arguably the vessel's most identifiable feature, and this was especially true in Titanic's era, when they were proudly painted in their company's colours. Now, it was an easy marketing opportunity, and paint schemes of all sorts were applied to make the company's fleet stand out. But even this idea was a relatively new one. Smokestacks hadn't even really been around that long because steamships had only become widespread some 50 or 60 years earlier in the mid-1800s. Early on, the stacks were usually painted black to hide the soot from all the thick coal smoke that was spewing out of them, but then something changed. One of the early steamship adopters was the famous Cunard Line, and their bright vermilion funnels and black bands soon became an icon of the transatlantic trade. Funnels, as we'll soon explore in more detail, are extremely hot, and they're made of very thin metal, so they need to be protected against corrosion and damage. In the early days of the steamship, engineer Robert Napier was grappling with the issue of painting a funnel. Regular paint would flake right off because of the heat. He patented a special mixture of buttermilk and red ochre, a weird mix that actually worked brilliantly because the heat of the funnel would then self-bake the concoction on and therefore make it stronger and more resilient. It resulted in a bright orange-red colour that soon was passed on to his business partner, a man named Samuel Cunard, who adopted it for his ships. The colour soon became known as Cunard Red, and the concept of brand recognition through the steamship's funnel colours was cemented. The idea took off as more and more steamship companies were founded and wanted to identify their ships from the pack. Cunard Line's great rival, the White Star Line, adopted their own recognisable colour scheme, a colour known as White Star Buff that was somewhere between a warm yellow and a light tan brown with a black top for the soot. Titanic carried those 4 immense funnels, each painted in the immediately recognisable White Star Buff paint scheme. So now we know the history behind why Titanic had so many funnels and why they looked the way they did. We need to deep dive into some engineering behind their function because this gives us some clues as to why they might have failed on the night of the sinking. Well, it turns out that Titanic's funnels, as viewed from the outside, were, if you'll forgive the pun, just the tip of the iceberg. The entire structure was complex and ran deep into the bowels of the ship. We'll start down here in the boiler rooms, where coal is burnt to boil water and generate huge amounts of steam. The steam is vented under pressure into the engines, but the excess smoke from the burning coal has nowhere to go. We already knew that. The Titanic's funnels served to vent the gases and the smoke, but they also helped the boilers burn hotter in the first place and more efficiently, purely because of their massive size. Now, we've covered this already in more detail in our video outlining the workings of Titanic's engines, but essentially, a fire needs oxygen to burn well, and getting oxygen into the bottom of a ship 10 stories below the upper deck is something of a challenge. Titanic used large fans called stokehold fans to suck in gallons of air from above and feed it directly into the boiler rooms themselves. They didn't feed the fires in the boilers directly. Instead, the boiler furnaces would draw the air in and around them, meaning the fresh air also helped to keep the room itself and the poor workers somewhat cool. Temperatures could still reach the high 40s in Celsius. That's between 110 and 120 Fahrenheit, but it was better than nothing. The fire in the boilers needed a draft to help suck in the fresh air and burn hotter, and this is where the funnels came in. It was actually all a simple mathematical equation. That many furnaces, and Titanic had 159 of them, needed a certain amount of oxygen for the most efficient burn, and this dictated the size of the funnel's internal flue. It worked just like the chimney of a house, but on an enormous scale. The internal flue size was guided by the amount of area that was needed to provide the optimum draft for burning in the furnaces. It's why old steamships' funnels were so big and tall. In fact, some were ridiculously so, like the poor old USS Helena here of 1897. So now we know the boilers are burning the coal and being fed a lot of fresh air, but all that soot and smoke generated from the furnaces has to go somewhere, and this is where the uptakes come in. Boiler uptakes were elaborate, branched structures made up of thin, riveted steel plates. Each branch connected to a boiler's smoke box and received the soot, the smoke and the gases directly from the boiler's furnaces. A complex system of internal baffle plates channeled the smoke by creating a draft and ensuring it was heading with force in the same direction at all times. The uptakes, and it cannot be stressed enough, were huge, and so was the amount of smoke pouring through them. As such, a huge chimney was needed to vent this well out of the ship, and here is where the first funnel structure actually comes into play. The lower funnel, spanning the top of the uptakes to the top of the boiler casings. Now, the lower funnels were fairly complex in their own right, but suffice it to say they acted as a flue and were split on the inside into sections to ensure optimum draft, even if one of the connected boiler rooms was non-operational at the time. The lower funnels would have been extremely hot to the touch. The gases being vented through them reached about 315 degrees Celsius, or 599 degrees Fahrenheit, so they were encased for their entire height by boiler casings, which shielded the public spaces from all that heat. This is why the interiors of Titanic featured the occasional odd rectangular structure right in the middle of large public rooms. They were well decorated, so you probably wouldn't really notice them, but they were really the boiler casings which housed the uptakes and the lower funnel, like this one down here on D-deck in the first class dining saloon and reception room, and this one here from the first class smoking room. Inside the casings, insulation like cotton silicate or cork slabs between 1.5 to 2 inches thick, that's about 5 centimeters, provided some insulation against the great heat. The lower funnels rose to the height of the boat deck houses at the top of the ship, and connected to this structure is the one we all know and love, the upper funnel, each some 60 odd feet tall, In fact, to account for the ship's shear, that is, the amount that it sagged in the middle, each funnel was a different height, the two tallest being numbers 2 and 3, so that from afar they would all look to actually be the same height. The funnels were actually deceptively complex in their internal layout, while also being extremely fragile in their construction. In the early days of steam, funnels had basically just been large chimneys that vented the smoke out and were extremely hot to the touch. Remember Napier's paint formula that actually baked itself onto the steel? Well, by Titanic's day, things had changed somewhat. To prevent burns, the funnel was made to be a double-walled structure made of riveted metal plates. Putting some distance between the inner and outer walls would mean the hot gases inside wouldn't heat the outside up as much as it might otherwise. The funnels were built as one piece in the Harland & Wolff shops, winched up onto massive cars, and then trundled out to Titanic as she waited at the fitting out wharf. They were craned up one by one, and then riveted to the ship's deck plates. We'll get to that in a minute. The inner structure was connected directly to the lower funnel, and took in the gases being vented from them and the uptakes. It was spaced apart from the outer structure by metal plates to ensure that the exterior of the funnel would not run as hot, and then to make sure the funnels retained their shape, they were reinforced with bands and stiffening rods at their tops to keep their elliptical cross-section. The funnels were made to be as lightweight but strong as possible. The ship was expected to rock and roll all over the place in bad weather, and those funnels would have to hold on for dear life. If they were built too heavy or over-engineered, no amount of bracing wires or reinforcement would hold them in place because they were each the height of a 5-story building. The steel plating used to make them was fairly robust, up to a ½ inch thick, that's about 13mm, but when you consider the thing was as tall as an apartment block, you realise they actually weren't too heavy duty at all. In fact, this unique footage shows the Cunard liner Berengaria of Titanic's vintage being scrapped in the 1930s, and watch what happens when the funnels lose their support wires and are brought down on the deck. The internal bracing and stiffening rods which have held them in shape for 2 decades are overcome, and the funnel flattens out like a pancake. Now, being this delicate and also being extremely tall, the funnels needed some good support to stay mounted to the constantly pitching and rolling ship, which was no easy task. Just imagine the amount of strain they'd be under in a storm. The funnels were connected to the ship's decks by 2 means. First, the very bottom of the upper funnel structure featured a flange, which was riveted directly to the deck plates. But this alone wouldn't hold the funnels in place. They needed to be supported all around to keep them upright. Now this was the job of the stays and shrouds, galvanized steel wire rope 1¼ inch or 3.17 centimeters thick, connected to the funnel's tops with shackles along one of those stiffening bands designed to help maintain the funnel's shape. We mentioned earlier that the funnels were double-walled to prevent excess heat, but despite this, believe it or not, when under steam, the funnels would actually lengthen because of how hot it was. There had to be allowance for the strain. Now because of this, the shrouds or cables couldn't be connected directly to the deck because they might snap under the pressure as the funnels became increasingly taller, even if only by inches or mere centimeters. To help with this, thick hemp rope, a lanyard, was woven around the shroud cables, and that was attached to pad eyes or shackles on the deck. This way the tension could actually be controlled. In fact, before lighting the boilers on departure, the funnel's shrouds would be actually slackened off by the crews at their lanyard so that the funnels could increase in size and the strain would be eased. The funnels were also a convenient place to mount other important pieces of equipment. Naturally, the ship's huge sets of whistles sat proudly on a platform towards the funnel's tops. Each funnel actually had its own set of these tri-bell type steam whistles, but only the forward 2 sets actually functioned. Forward and abaft or behind the funnels were mounted tall waste steam pipes, which could be used to vent excess steam out of the boilers if the engines were stopped or if too much steam was being generated. Because the funnels provided a nice, tall surface, various water pipes could be fitted to them too. You can see them in photos. The U-shaped piping runs up about half the height. This means that the water system for the ship's taps was provided with a natural pressure from the gravity afforded by mounting the pipes to the tall funnels. So now we well know what Titanic's funnels were made out of, how they functioned, and how they were attached to the ship. But on the night of the sinking, something very strange happened. Those carefully engineered structures came crashing dramatically down. Something had gone horribly wrong. At about 2:15 AM, all hell had broken loose on the roof of the officers' quarters underneath the ship's first funnel. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was working with a group of sailors to prepare an Engelhardt collapsible lifeboat for lowering when the ship sank out from underneath his feet with an alarming plunge. It sent a wave rolling up the boat deck, knocking people over and sucking Lightoller down, pinning him up against a ventilator's grating as water rushed in to fill the empty void below. Lightoller was eventually blasted off by a rush of hot air and came to the surface near the collapsible boat that he'd tried to help free. It had floated clean off the deck as the ship sank. He explained himself what happened next at the inquiry when he said, "I just held onto something, a piece of rope or something, and was there for a little while, and then the forward funnel fell down. It fell within 3 or 4 inches of the boat. It lifted the boat bodily and threw her about 20 feet clear of the ship, as near as I could judge." Now that was an incredible near miss, and extremely fortunate for those who were clinging onto the boat for dear life, but others were not so lucky. Dick Norris Williams was a rising tennis star travelling with his father in first class. They were both swept into the water by the downwards plunge too, and Richard caught sight of his father swimming towards him. He later wrote, "I saw one of the 4 great funnels come crashing down on top of him. Just for one instant, I stood there transfixed, not because it had only missed me by a few feet. Curiously enough, not because it had killed my father, for whom I had a far more than normal feeling of love and attachment, but there I was transfixed, wondering at the enormous size of this funnel, still belching smoke. It seemed to me that 2 cars could have been driven through it side by side." As the funnels came down, we can assume they flattened out now that the bracing was overcome, just as we saw in that footage of Berengaria's scrapping. Even worse was to come though. With the funnels down and detached from their seatings on the deck, a gaping maw was left behind, where, according to passenger Eugene Daly, people were sucked in by a torrent of water like flies. It's very grim stuff. As if the ship's sinking wasn't already bad enough, the collapsing funnels, and by the way, number 2 went down soon after number 1 did in a shower of sparks and soot, took quite a few people with them. So what had happened? These funnels were designed to weather the worst of the Atlantic storms, the heavy pitching and rolling in huge seas. They were lightly built, heavily braced and reinforced, but still they had failed. Lightoller presented his own theory at the inquiries when he said, "The terrific strain of bringing the after end of that huge hull clear out of the water caused the expansion joint abaft number 1 funnel to open up. The fact that the 2 wire stays to this funnel on the after part led over and abaft the expansion joint threw on them an extraordinary strain, eventually carrying away the port wire guy to be followed almost immediately by the starboard one. Instantly the port one parted, the funnel started to fall, but the fact that the starboard one held on a moment or 2 longer gave this huge structure a pull to that side of the ship." Titanic had 2 big expansion joints for her upper decks. Bridges actually use these today for similar reasons. Essentially, large structures tend to bend and sag, or lengthen and shorten depending on conditions. For a ship like Titanic, her hull was designed to hog and sag to some extent over big waves. If built too stiffly, it would simply break apart in a heavy sea because there was no easing of the strain. The superstructure on top of Titanic wasn't part of the hull, it was simply attached and would be expected to bend and sag along with it. To help it do this without tearing any of the steel plating that made it up, expansion joints were fitted, breaks in the structure that were separated by a short distance. In passenger spaces, the joint was covered with brass and leather to hide it or at least make it barely noticeable, but with the expansion joints fitted, the superstructure could now flex with the ship's hull. And as Lightoller noted, the immense strain of the sinking was causing Titanic's hull and superstructure atop it to hog. That is, bend downwards, thanks to the effects of gravity pushing the stern down as it was rising higher through the sinking. With the expansion joints opened up, the stays or support cables which supported the after part of the funnel were on the other side of the expansion joint, and his theory suggests that they were suddenly under huge strain and that they failed. But the question has to be asked though, was the parting of those stays the cause of the collapse, or just a symptom? See, Titanic's funnel stays and shrouds were designed to withstand a huge amount of pressure. On the transatlantic run, heavy seas and rolling waves could cause a ship to roll and list either 10, 15, or 20 degrees or more. Now, this type of experience was commonplace, and ship design had to take it into account. It's worth remembering that Olympic, throughout her entire career, in rough seas and storms, never lost a funnel. And it's hard to imagine that Harland and Wolff designed the funnels such that the parting of one or two stays could ever possibly cause a collapse in the first place. In fact, the last two funnels on Titanic remained in place high up in the air. Funnel number 3 had a pair of stays that crossed over an after expansion joint as well, but that funnel remained in place until the ship broke apart underneath it. It shed some doubt on Lightoller's theory. If it was just the effects of gravity and the opened expansion joints at play, shouldn't all 4 funnels have come down at the same time? Well, the timing of the funnel's collapse actually gives us our first major clue as to what was actually happening. Funnel number 1 collapsed when water, roaring up the boat deck, met its base, and then number 2 did the same thing. Clearly, the water was having some effect, but what? At the British inquiry into the disaster, naval architect Edward Wilding, who'd actually helped design the ship, gave his opinion when he said, "The funnels are carried from the casings in the way of the comparatively light upper decks, that is the boat and the A deck. When these decks became submerged and the water got inside those houses, the water would rise outside much faster than inside, and the excessive pressure on the comparatively light casings, which are not made to take a pressure of that kind, would cause the casing to collapse, would take the seating out from under the funnel and bring the funnel down." Now, water pressure is capable of terrifying things, as anybody familiar with the effects of delta P can testify. 1 foot of water pressure equates to roughly 3.06 kilopascals, or less than half a pound per square inch. But as water rushed up the funnel's base as the bow sank, the pressure increased dramatically. At 10 feet, the funnel's base would have been under some 30.6 kilopascals, or 4.4 psi of pressure, and the casings and deck houses down on A deck would now be under 92 kilopascals, or 13 psi of pressure. Now, what Wilding was suggesting was that the lower funnels and the casings were buckled by the water pressure, and this brought the funnel down too. But the evidence from the wreck suggests otherwise, because the casings and the lower funnel are still all there in fine shape. It seems more likely that water rushing up the boat deck surged around the base of number 1 funnel, and then the pressure began to mount. We know the funnel collapsed sometime after Lightoller surfaced nearby, meaning that the funnel would have had to have sunk for a while and its base would have been at quite a depth when it came down. Perhaps it was as deep as 20 feet or 6 meters. With the entire interior of that funnel, the lower funnel and the casings not yet flooded and now under extreme pressures, a structural failure would have been inescapable. It's not implausible to think that water pressure began to buckle the base of Titanic's forward funnels, because at 25 feet of depth, the funnel's base would have been under around 11 psi, or 74.5 kilopascals. As the base buckled and the funnel began to topple, excess pressure on the shrouds and the stays would have caused them to snap. To those in the water outside, like Lightoller, it might have looked as if the shrouds and the stays were straining and snapping, causing the funnel to fall, but it was actually the other way around. 11 psi doesn't sound like a lot, but acting on something as big, hollow, and lightly built as Titanic's funnels, it seems likely that the ocean's pressure at that depth could have brought them down. We know the water pressure was enough to collapse the grand staircase dome cover directly behind the number 1 funnel almost as soon as it was immersed in water, for example. Today on the wreck, there's no structure there at all, just an open hole where it once sat. Another clue to the water pressure hypothesis is the fate of funnels 3 and 4, which remained attached comfortably, high and dry, despite that ridiculous 20 to 30 degree angle down and the same list to the side that the forward funnels had endured. These funnels only detached during the breakup, when the forces of gravity became simply far too much for the structures to endure. Other ships from Titanic's era sank with surprising results. In 1916, Titanic's sister ship Britannic sank after striking a mine off Kea in Greece, and the result was very similar. Like Titanic, her funnels seemed to collapse one by one in turn, with survivor Corporal J. Waugh stating that as each funnel touched the water, it was torn off just like paper. Curiously though, just a year prior, the liner RMS Lusitania had sunk too, but her funnels remained attached as they were pulled underwater. Surely they must have been under similar forces as Titanic and Britannic's. Well, even though she was some 10,000 tons smaller than Titanic, Lusitania's funnels were even taller. But interestingly, they were actually braced with double sets of shrouds and stays at 2 different levels compared to Titanic's 1. If the bases of Lusitania's funnels began to crumple and fail, it could be that the much greater number of support cables was able to take up the strain and keep them in place. On top of that, differences in the makeup of the funnels, the plating thickness, the amount of stiffeners and internal reinforcement, it all might have meant that Titanic and Britannic's funnel designs were just more susceptible to failing and collapsing once subjected to water pressures than Lusitania's ever were. That's not a fault on the part of the designers though. No ship's funnel would ever need to endure that kind of punishment in normal life. Titanic's funnels are an incredibly iconic part of the ship's exterior, so much so that just the sight of any four-funneled ship will invariably bring up the story of Titanic. Show your regular person a photograph of Aquitania, and chances are they'll call it Titanic. The number and size of a ship's funnels rose to symbolise that vessel's size and power, but in time they fell out of favour, possibly thanks to the Titanic disaster in part, but mostly due to changing tastes. In the 1920s, ships' funnels became smaller and more streamlined. There's just something so Victorian and industrial about the tall, straight funnels of Titanic's day, almost exactly like a factory chimney. As Art Deco took hold, ships' funnels shrank in size and became more shapely thanks to liners like Germany's Bremen and the USA's SS America. Today, ships still have funnels, but they're almost more of an afterthought. Ships aren't packed with dozens of boilers anymore, only diesel engines, meaning a single funnel is usually enough to do the job. Few could be considered iconic, save maybe for that of the Queen Mary II, whose funnel shape was designed specifically to be short enough to fit under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in New York, while featuring a large wind scoop to make sure that the smoke lifts high over the heads of the ship's passengers. I shot this footage myself last year, and I can tell you from experience that it definitely works. In a fitting touch, the funnel of this ship, the last and the largest Oceanliner ever built, is finished in a variation of Cunard red, the same colour that Napier had developed all the way back in the early 1800s. Today on the wreck of Titanic, there is very little sign of those once proud and towering funnels. They broke free of the ship, but their shrouds and stays remained attached, causing havoc as they ripped up and down the deck, those 1¼ inch, 3.17 centimetre thick cables tearing lifeboat davits and equipment clean off the decks. The funnels themselves likely flattened out as they hit the water, like we saw with Berengaria's. Now, their only remains are some nearly unrecognisable piles of tangled plating and pipes on the ocean floor. It's hard to believe these majestic things once towered high over the ocean in the days when Titanic was the newest, finest ship in the world. Anybody familiar with the wreck of Titanic knows that there are parts of it that are completely missing. And one of those parts, very famously, the Grand Staircase, completely gone. There are other parts, however, the wheelhouse, the navigating bridge, completely disintegrated. There's just nothing there. But above the Grand Staircase sat the famous wrought iron dome, the very famous decorative dome. And then sitting on top of that was a extremely lightly built weather cover, purely designed to allow light into the Grand Staircase from above. So the roof of this weather cover was covered in tiny little rectangular panes of glass. It's just completely gone. There's nothing there on the wreck. And so that has provided explorers like James Cameron and Woodsole Oceanographic Institute to park submersibles on the roof of the officers' quarters and send their ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles, those little robots that can swim out from the submarines and then down into the Grand Staircase of the ship, and therefore accessing all the major passenger decks. Today, there's, like I said, nothing there. It's just a massive gaping maw at the top of the ship. But what happened to it? People often say that the Grand Staircase dome imploded, which makes sense. But what does that actually mean, and how did it happen? Well, something happened at the start of this year. A ship sank in Sydney Harbour, an old Sydney-built Manly ferry named the Barragulla. And her sinking, I think, demonstrates a couple of very interesting points that can do a lot to explain what happened to some of the things and structures that are missing on board Titanic. Last week, at the start of January 2022, the Australian-built Manly ferry MV Barragulla sank at her moorings in Sydney Harbour. The ship was a relic of Sydney's rich maritime past, and she had plied the popular route to Manly for decades. She was retired in the 1980s and slated for conservation, but work stalled and the ship sat for years corroding away. I saw her 2 weeks before she sank, and it was clear that her hull was in bad shape. Tragically, on the night of January 1st, her hull probably corroded through, she began taking on water, and she sank. Now, as I record this, the ship is awkwardly positioned on her port side, half submerged, with her deck houses jutting clear out of the water. But what, you may be asking, does this have to do with the Titanic? Barragulla was a steel-hulled vessel, but her upper decks were primarily taken up with passenger spaces made of timber, glass, and even lighter steel plating. Essentially, a long, lightly built, enclosed passenger observation space took up the majority of the vessel's upper decks. Photographs recently taken of the sunken ship show something really interesting. Despite the fact that she had settled relatively slowly, the entire forward part of this enclosed passenger space has completely disintegrated and broken up, with timber panels floating away in clumps and bulkheads buckled and destroyed. What kind of destructive forces were at play here to cause such damage? Fortunately, while the vessel was foundering, bystanders on a nearby wharf managed to record video. I'm going to play a quick segment of this video now. It was taken from a wharf directly above Barragulla as she sank, and I want you to listen extremely carefully to the sinking. Incredibly, in the video you can hear timber creaking and snapping and panes of glass as they begin to shatter against the weight of water as it presses up against the windows. What you're hearing is the effect of water pressure in action. Barragulla's hull was flooding rapidly, bringing the ship lower and lower into the ocean as it continued to flood. But the deck houses and passenger spaces were not yet filled. They were empty on the inside. Here we have a pressure imbalance, and the deeper the ship settles into the water, the greater that the pressure becomes. This is the same effect that takes place when a car lands in water. And this has been the demise of many unfortunate drivers, as anybody who, like me, has recently taken to watching YouTube channels like Adventures with Purpose or Exploring with Nug would know. As soon as a car becomes waterborne, the doors simply cannot open. At 5 feet of depth, the amount of force exerted on a car door would equal about 1,995 pounds of force. That's about 904 kilograms. At a depth of 10 feet, the forces would increase to in excess of 7,000 pounds, or about 3,350 kilograms, on each car door. Now imagine these forces acting on the empty interior spaces of a sinking ship, and you begin to understand the potential for destruction. When Titanic sank, her hull naturally filled first, while her lighter constructed superstructure remained mostly dry until the very end. We've actually talked about the effects of water pressure before in relation to Titanic's funnels in my Why Did Titanic's Funnels Fall video. And now we can apply that same logic to lighter built sections of Titanic's superstructure. The grand staircase dome and weather cover, as it slipped beneath the ocean, wouldn't have stood a chance, because it's extremely lightly built, just like Barragulla's superstructure, mostly of things like lightweight steel, glass, or maybe timber. The same could be said of Titanic's wheelhouse. This was a totally enclosed space, lightly built of timber planking, so as not to interfere with the magnetic navigation equipment on board. James Cameron and his team theorized that the wheelhouse disintegrated after the mast collapsed back onto it during the final plunge to the ocean floor. But it probably isn't unlikely that being so lightly built, the wheelhouse simply broke up, just like Barragulla's superstructure, as it was immersed in water. The timber planks and panels probably just didn't have enough time to saturate with water and therefore remain in place. So as they submerged, they likely began to tear themselves apart and float freely away. We can only assume that this is what happened to the grand staircase at some point between the initial flooding and violent impact with the sea floor. Titanic sinking was a violent affair, especially once the ship settled more quickly towards the end. We can see this very well represented in the 1997 film directed by James Cameron, where windows begin to implode, the grand staircase dome shatters, and great spouts of air are forced out of the ship thanks to the sudden and violent ingress of water. Based on all of this, we can imagine that, as it slipped beneath the waves, Titanic's grand staircase weather cover would have broken up almost immediately under extreme forces, and the dome beneath would have been shattered under tons and tons of water. That's why today on the wreck, there is not even a sign of the structure that once was, just a deep, dark well down into the heart of the wreck. So there you have it. Sinking ships are an extremely hostile environment, and they can be a very, very violent event. They may look peaceful from afar. I know a lot of Titanic survivors said that the ship seemed to simply slip beneath the waves, but there's a lot of destructive forces at play, such as the effects of water pressure that we've discussed today. There's a lot of examples of bulkheads collapsing, the wooden separating bulkheads between staterooms collapsing while people were inside. And even down in the boiler rooms, there was a bulkhead separating two of the boiler rooms that collapsed. A steel bulkhead. So this stuff is really no joke. Well, I hope you all found this interesting. It's really tragic to see that Baragula is gone. She was just shy of her 100th year anniversary. So it's a real shame to see her sunk, and she continues to break up even while I'm recording this video, and there's nothing, I think, that could be salvaged, so it looks like she's going to be scrapped in situ. It feels a bit mean to have Baragula as a post-thought or an afterthought to this video and make the focus Titanic, but I just thought it really adequately demonstrated these destructive forces, because the first time I watched that video of the ship sinking, I was just glued to the audio. Hearing the breakup and hearing all that glass shattering was just shockingly violent for, a small ship sinking relatively slowly. You don't, I guess, realize a lot of the destructive forces at play there. So getting up close and personal and seeing a sinking ship like that is a fairly rare occurrence. So sad to see Baragula go. Absolutely tragic, but very interesting to see these things demonstrated. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.